Hey, this is Charles with Rocky Mountain ATV-MC. Today we're reassembling our RZR 900 engine. This is part 5 of our engine rebuilding series. In this video, we're just focusing on the reassembly of the engine. So if you need to know how to get to this point, then go back and watch our other videos. So go grab your wrenches and we'll get started. To do this job, we need some plain bearings. The ones we have here are from Hot Rods, and these ones, we've got a main bearing and seal kit right here, but you may need some other sizes as well. We'll show you how to figure that out in a little bit. We're also using a new cam chain. This one's from Hot Cams. We're using the Vertex complete gasket set along with the piston kits. And then on top of that, we need some gasket maker, and Polaris recommends using new rod bolts, the case half bolts, and the cylinder head bolts. Now, once we've got everything together, we want to have everything fresh. So we have some new spark plugs, we've got a new air filter, and a Tusk oil change kit. The tools we need to do this job are the cylinder holding and camshaft timing plate. We also have our engine mount adapter, a breaker bar, a couple torque wrenches, one for inch pounds, one for foot pounds. We have some common hand tools, torque angle gauge, strap wrench, rag, safety glasses, and some rubber gloves. And to go along with our adapter plate, we have our engine stand. This is just going to make the job a lot easier, and that way we can rotate the engine upside down. To get this engine back together, we need to determine which plain bearings we need to use. So for the connecting rods, we've got a number and a letter right here. The number is going to be an indicator for which bearing we need to use. So we'll write that down. And your machine might have different numbers and letters as we go throughout this process, but just write that down for now. And ours is a number 2. Same thing with our other rod. Now we'll move on to the crankshaft. We have a series of 6 letters coming down here. Ours are all G, so we'll write those down, and those letters are going to correlate to each journal. So starting on the flywheel side or mag side, we're going to have number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. On the crankcase half, we have a 6-digit number. The first 4 digits are going to correlate to our main bearings on the crankshaft. The last 2 correlate to our counterbalancer bearings, but on this Polaris 900, we actually don't have any options for different bearings, so the last 2 numbers, we're not even going to worry about those. To figure out the rod bearings, what we'll do, we've got the magneto side rod. It's a number 2 in the end cap. So the magneto side rod journal is a G on our chart, and that's correlating to the crankshaft. So we'll take the G and the number 2, compare it to the chart in our service manual, and that's going to give us a green bearing. So the number 2 position on that for our rod bearing is going to be a green bearing. Now to figure out the PTO side rod, we've got a number 2 on that end cap, and then if we go to the PTO side journal, we've got a G right there. So we'll compare the G and number 2 to the chart in the book, and that's going to give us a green bearing as well. So I've gone down to the number 4 position on the crankshaft, and that's going to be a green bearing. Now to figure out the main bearings, I'm going to go to the first one. So for that, it's going to be a G on the crank, and then on the case, the first one is going to be a number 2. So we'll compare those readings to the chart in the book, and that's going to give us a green bearing for this number 1 main bearing. Now for the second main bearing, I'm going to look on the crankshaft. That's the number 3 position on the crankshaft. That's going to be a G, and on the case, that's the number 2 position on the case. That's going to be a number 1. Compare those readings to the chart in the book, and so the number 3 position on our crankshaft, we're going to have a blue bearing. Now we'll go ahead and do the same procedure for the other 2 main bearings. Now that we have our bearings selected, we need to get the pistons ready for installation. So to do that, I'm going to install one of these circlips, and when you install these, you want this open end either in the 6 o'clock position or in the 12 o'clock position. So I'm just going to start by inserting one end, and this will be sideways in there, and I'm going to place my thumb over it, And then I'm going to slowly rock it into place with this screwdriver while I press down with my thumb. And you don't want to bend it too much, you just kind of want to gently rock it into place. And we heard that snap down in there. So we'll make sure that the open end is at 12 o'clock and make sure that it's snapped in all the way around. So the next thing to take note of, on this piston there's a triangle. This is going to go to your exhaust side. And when we install the connecting rod, if you're reusing the old ones, the manual recommends keeping these in the same orientation they were before. If you're using a new connecting rod, it doesn't matter which way it goes on. So to install this, what I'm going to do is take a little bit of oil. We'll put this on our wrist pin and I'll slide this part way in on the piston through the opposite side that we put the circlip into. And then I'm going to take this connecting rod, put a little bit of oil in the small end, and then we'll slide the wrist pin through it. So with the wrist pin all the way in, we can now put the other circlip in place. Now, even though we put a little bit of oil on that wrist pin, it's a good idea to also put some oil on these bores where the wrist pin rides before you install that wrist pin. Now that we have our connecting rod installed onto the piston, we can install the rings. So we'll start with the oil ring, and this is our expansion ring right here. And we want to have this gap towards the PTO side. So again, this arrow is facing the exhaust side. So we'll go ahead and put this down into place, and you want to make sure these ends don't overlap. Then we've got these side rails. So this first one, I'm going to put this gap towards the exhaust side. This is going to go on the very bottom. And then this next one, we'll put the gap facing towards the back of the piston. The next thing we'll do is install the second ring. Now this is important. This is going to be the black ring. There's a chrome one and a black one. And when we install this, we have the markings facing up. And then we're also going to have it facing, this gap facing the intake side of the piston. Now for the top ring, we've got our marking facing up, and then the gap's going to face the exhaust side of the piston. Now this piston and connecting rod are good to go. We'll install these into the cylinder and we'll apply some oil to these rings and the piston, and then we'll do the same thing to the other piston. And before we put those pistons in, we're also going to lube this cylinder up with some fresh engine oil. Now, making sure that all the rings are in their correct positions, we'll go ahead and install the piston. Now keep in mind, we've got this arrow facing this side of the cylinder. This is going to be towards the exhaust. When we slide this into place, make sure you have the rings completely compressed, and that way you don't catch one of the ring edges on anything or damage it. The next thing we'll do is lube up our new cam chain and the oil pump drive chain. And to do that, I'm just using some assembly lube. Next, we'll install these chains onto the crank. And the other thing you want to do is apply assembly lube or oil to all of these journals. Next, we'll install this main seal. Now this seal did come with grease on it already. If yours didn't, you want to make sure you have a thin film of grease on the seal. The next thing we'll do is put our engine stand adapter plate onto our upper case half. And to do that, we've got this bushing. This goes right where the starter normally does. And then the two bolts mount where the starter normally does as well. Now we'll slide the adapter into the engine stand. Now we can set the base gasket into place. And I'll take the cylinder assembly, we'll drop that into place as well, and we'll make sure that both dowel pins line up. After that, we'll take the cylinder holding plate and we'll install this. These bolts don't have to be crazy tight. We'll just snug them up. And again, this is just going to hold the cylinder in place while we flip the motor upside down. All right, next we'll install these plain bearings. And to do that, I'm going to start with this tab and we'll set that into place and press it down. Now, one thing I want to point out on this, the Hot Rods plain bearing kit just comes with the green bearings, so if you need additional bearings, like we needed the blue ones, we did get those from Hot Rods, but we got them individually in a separate package. Also, you want to make sure you're wearing rubber gloves when you handle these bearings. All right, the next thing I'm going to do is apply a thin film of engine oil on all of these bearings. All right, with these bearings oiled up, I'm going to take the oil drain diverter and set this down into place. There's two tabs that it's going to rest on. And then once this is sitting down in place, we'll install the crankshaft and we're going to line everything up. You need to pay attention to these chains while you set them down. The oil pump drive chain I'm just kind of lifting up on to keep it out of the way. And then you want to pick a connecting rod that the journal will ride in. And it's just going to help everything line up a little bit easier. So while we're doing all of this, we also want to line up this oil seal right here. So we're looking pretty good all the way around. Now we need to line up the last connecting rod. To do that, I'm going to push up on the piston while I guide it into place. Next, we'll install the plain bearings into the connecting rod caps. And we'll take a little bit of engine oil, put it on the bearing. And then after this, we'll put the caps onto the connecting rods, but make sure you have the serial numbers lined up and they should match. So this number right here should match this one on the rod. Now we'll install our new connecting rod bolts. And we're going to snug these down a little bit and then tighten them down to 9 foot-pounds. And then we're going to be doing a couple sequences to get them to the final torque. And then the next step on these is 13 foot-pounds. Now we can take our torque angle gauge and we're going to go another 105 degrees. So we're at 105 right there, and we'll go ahead and do the same thing on the other side. Now we'll repeat these same procedures for the other connecting rod. The next thing we need to do is install the counterbalancer, and to do that we'll put a little bit of oil on these journals, both sides. Keep in mind this has the alignment mark, so we've got a dot right here on one of these teeth. Now once it is in, you'll verify that both of these marks line up. The next thing we'll do is apply some silicone sealant to the case halves, and when we do this, make sure you just use a little bit, because if you use too much it's going to get in your oil galleyways and it's going to create some problems. So just use it sparingly. It's just to take up any imperfections in the casting. Now we've gone ahead and installed the other platen bearings in the lower case half. So what we need to do now is install it onto the upper case half. The next thing we'll do is install our 8 new bolts. Next we'll take these 2 M8 bolts, install those. And we are reusing those 2 and this M6 bolt on the very end. And it does have a tightening sequence, so we're going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. To get these M10 bolts torqued properly, we're going to torque them down in a couple of different steps and then go a certain amount of degrees. So we'll start out with 9 foot-pounds. Then we're going to take it up to 21 foot-pounds. So after that, we're going to go an additional 90 degrees on all of these M10 bolts. Now these next two bolts will torque to 26 foot-pounds. And then this M6 will torque to 9 foot-pounds. Now we're going to rotate the engine so it's facing up. And now we're going to install the other crankcase bolts coming from the top side going down. Now these bolts have a sequence to torque them down as well. So we're going to start with these two larger bolts. We'll torque those to 26 foot-pounds. And then after that, we're actually going to work our way around the case. And these are going to be torqued to 89 inch-pounds. And that's for all of these smaller bolts. Now for the final torquing, the service manual wants us to go back through the same procedure to make sure everything's torqued down. Now that we have these upper bolts tightened down, we're going to go ahead and flip this engine back over. So now we're ready to install our oil pump. To do that, I'm just using a hook tool to pull up this oil pump drive chain, and I'm just going to set it through there for now. Now I've got the oil pump and this new O-ring. I'm going to put just a little bit of grease on this O-ring to help hold it in place while we install it. That way I don't have to worry about it falling out. So now we'll take the drive chain, put it onto the sprocket, and set the pump into place. Then our next step, we'll just put the dowels in place and we'll torque the 3 bolts to 89 inch-pounds. Next, we have our oil pickup gasket already in place, so we're going to install this oil pickup. And again, we're going to torque this bolt to 89 inch-pounds. Our next step is to put sealant on this lower case half, and then we'll put the oil pan on. Don't forget to put a little sealant right here, otherwise you'll get a little bit of oil leaking from the bolt that goes in that oil pan. And again, we're just putting a really light coating on here. This is just really just taking any case imperfections and filling those up. All right, now we'll put our oil pan on and put the bolts in place. There is a tightening pattern for the bolts, and I'll show you that in a minute. So the small ones are going to be 106 inch-pounds, and these big ones are 26 foot-pounds. Next, we'll install our drain bolt, and we're using the new crush washer that came in our Tusk oil change kit. And the torque on this drain plug is 12 foot-pounds. Now that we have the pan on, we'll go ahead and flip the motor right side up. Now we'll go ahead and remove our cylinder holding plate. And at this point, I'm going to install our oil cooler. I'm using new O-rings, and I've put a little bit of oil on those O-rings. So we'll put the oil cooler in place and tighten these bolts down. All right, the next thing we'll do is take our Woodruff key, and we're going to put this in place on the crankshaft. And this one's actually a little tight, so I'm just going to tap this into place. The next thing we'll do is install these cam chain tensioners. So I'm just going to set this down into place, put the bolt in there, and then both of these, we're going to torque these down to 89 inch-pounds. The next thing we need to do is get the crankshaft ready to install the flywheel. We need to remove any grease or oil from the taper on the end of this crankshaft, and also the taper on the flywheel. We need to clean that out as well. And then there's a bushing on the starter gear that runs just behind the flywheel. So to keep any oil from getting back on the taper, I'm just going to put a little assembly lube on this flat portion of the crankshaft right here. Now that we have the tapers cleaned and some assembly lube on the flat portion of the crankshaft, we'll take the flywheel and we'll align this groove with the woodruff key, and then we'll install the bolt. All right, to torque this flywheel bolt down, what we're going to do is pull the cam chain up. And I want this out of the way because when I'm torquing down the bolt, just in case the crankshaft moves, I don't want to bind our brand new cam chain. The next thing we'll do is install the strap wrench. And then we're going to torque this bolt down to 133 foot-pounds. The next thing we're going to do is make sure the cylinder surface where it meets the cylinder head is perfectly clean. There's no oil on it. So I'm just going to put a little contact cleaner on my rag and make sure everything's wiped up really good. Next, we'll take the head gasket and set it into place. Make sure it lines up with the dowel pins. What we'll do next is set the cylinder head on here, and again, make sure the cylinder head sealing surface is perfectly clean. And then as we set this into place, again, make sure it lines up with the dowel pins. Now that we've got the cylinder head on, I'm going to pull this cam chain up. You can either use a pick or your magnet, whatever's easier for you to use. And just for now, I'm going to hang this chain off of it, and then we'll install our 6 new cylinder head studs, and then we're going to reuse these 2 that are on the side. Now these studs, there is a tightening sequence, so we're going to follow that. First, I'm just going to snug all of these bolts down. And like I said on these side ones, I'm just getting them started and just getting them close. We're going to torque these main bolts first to 9 foot-pounds, and then we'll torque these down at the very end. The next torque spec in the sequence is 26 foot-pounds. Now that they're torqued to 26 foot-pounds, the next step is to turn these bolts 180 degrees. Now we can tighten these side bolts to 89 inch-pounds. The next step, we're going to hang this cam chain by a wire. We're just using some Tusk mechanics wire. I'll wrap it around the chain, and I just made a little hook. Hang it from the side right there. And the reason we're doing that is I'm going to place both camshafts in place after we put the original buckets in. And since our head, we did have to do a little bit of machining on it. We reconditioned the seats. So we're going to check our valve clearances and make sure everything's correct before we do all of our timing. So when you're doing this, make sure you apply a little bit of oil to all of the components. All right, so I've loosely set these cam caps into place, and we're going to follow the tightening sequence to get them snugged down, and then we'll torque them to 89 inch-pounds. Now, something I want to point out, just to check these clearances, I'm making sure that the cam lobes are facing up, and that way we can check the clearances without having to rotate the camshaft. So we're going to start with number 1 right here. Just snug it down. This is number 2. We've got 3, number 4, 5, 6. So then we've got 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. All right, now to check these clearances, I'm guessing these exhaust valve clearances are going to be pretty close because this camshaft is easy to rotate. If I try to rotate this intake camshaft, it's actually got quite a bit of drag and we're probably going to have to do some adjustment. So to check this exhaust valve clearance, you want these cam lobes facing away from the tappet. So I've got this where we'd normally check it, and I'm just going to start with the recommended clearance. On this machine, it's actually 12 thousandths of an inch, plus or minus 2 thousandths. So this 12 does not fit right there. It does fit in the next. Then I'm going to rotate the camshaft a little bit. Fits on that one and does not fit on the very end. So I'm going to write these two down and then measure these two outer ones and see where we're at. So the 11 thousandths fits in this outer one. So we're within specification right there. And then this 11 thousandths fits on this outer one as well. So we're 11, 12, 12, and 11. So we're right within specification on this one. We'll go ahead and measure these intakes. I'm actually just going to start with a 2 thousandths of an inch feeler gauge just to see which ones have clearance and which ones don't. So none of them show 2 thousandths. Our feeler gauges actually go down to 1 thousandths. I'll try to run that in there. So this valve right here is the only one with clearance left. So what we're going to have to do, I'm going to take these back out and look at all the buckets and numbers and write down which buckets go where, and that way you know which bucket correlates with which measurement. And then if you have different size buckets, if you have smaller ones on the exhaust side, then you can actually substitute them on this intake side and then take your measurements again, and then you might have a better idea of where you need to go and which buckets you need to order. All right, for the next step, we need to get the PTO side piston at top dead center. So to figure it out, the manual wants us to put this line on the flywheel right in the center of the hole where this pickup sensor normally goes, but it's kind of hard to turn this over without having camshafts or anything up here. So what we're going to do is stick a small flat blade screwdriver down into the hole, and then we're going to rotate the flywheel until we see this screwdriver peek out. And when you do this, make sure you're holding the cam chain up. So we just passed top dead center. You can see it start falling now. So you want to get it right in the center where it peaks out. So, and you can see on ours, there's this tab right here. This line is directly in line with that. So once we do put that stator cover on, we're going to verify the timing through that hole. But for now, we know this is on top dead center. Now that we're on top dead center, I'm going to go ahead and install all of these tappets, and we're also going to install the camshafts. And when I'm doing this, I'm just going to put a little bit of assembly lube on everything. All right, now that we have these camshafts set into place, we're going to put the camshaft holders on, and we're going to tighten the holders in a crisscross pattern. And then we're going to use our cam holding tool, and we're going to line these splits in the back of the camshafts. We're going to line those up and that's going to keep them right where they need to be for top dead center compression on the PTO cylinder. And after you put the new shims in place, you can go ahead and check your clearances and verify that everything's correct. The next thing we'll do is install our cam sprockets. So this is our exhaust sprocket. We want to install that side first. So to do that, we've got these two lines. These are going to go level with the cylinder head, and the E stands for exhaust. So that's going to be on our exhaust cam. So we'll pull the cam chain up, and then when we install the sprocket onto the cam, again, we want to make sure those lines are level with the cylinder head. So I've got one more tooth to rotate it. So we still have this piston at top dead center compression, and our lines are level with the cylinder head, so we know we're good on that. I'm going to go ahead and install the cam sprocket bolt, and I applied a little bit of Loctite to those threads just to be on the safe side. Now we'll do the same thing with the intake sprocket, and we're looking at the eyes on the level line now. With the cam sprockets installed, we can now remove this cam holding plate, and I'm actually going to rotate the engine until we can gain access to the other side of the sprocket bolts, and we'll torque those down to 14 foot-pounds, rotate the engine back over to top dead center on the PTO cylinder, and we'll torque these bolts to 14 foot-pounds as well. Now we'll install the remaining camshaft carrier, and we're going to torque these bolts down to 89 inch-pounds, and we'll follow the torquing sequence in the manual. Next, we'll take the cam chain tensioner and apply some oil to it, and then we're going to torque this down to 29.5 foot-pounds. Next, we'll rotate the engine over 2 full revolutions and then check our timing marks. And since we don't have the flywheel cover on yet, what we're going to do is just the same thing with the screwdriver. Bring it to its highest point. So with the PTO cylinder at top dead center, we want to make sure that the eyes on the intake cam, that those lines are level with the cylinder head, and then same thing with the exhaust cam. The lines with the E's are level with the cylinder head. So we know we're good to go. We'll verify everything once we install the stator cover as well. All right, the next thing we'll do is install the starter gear. So I'm going to put a little assembly lube on the shaft, and we'll go ahead and set this into place. Next, we'll install the stator cover gasket and the stator cover and torque it down to spec. And before I install the stator cover, I'm going to install a little bit of sealant right where this rubber piece meets the stator cover. Now, as you go on with the stator cover, keep in mind that it is magnetized. We'll just line that up with the dowel pins. Next, we'll install all of the stator cover bolts, and we're going to torque these down to 106 inch-pounds in the sequence that's recommended in the service manual. All right, to verify our timing marks, we're going to take this crankshaft position sensor out. So the other cylinder's cam lobes are under spring tension, and to get everything lined up, I'm going to use a 21mm wrench on one of the camshafts and put these marks right in alignment right there. And I'm looking straight down, our mark is right on the money. For the valve cover gasket, we're going to put a dab of silicone on these corners right here, just because some of these gaskets have a tendency to leak right there. Now we'll go ahead and lay this gasket into place. Now we'll take the valve cover, put it in place, and tighten our bolts down. Now we'll go ahead and reinstall the crankshaft position sensor and tighten the bolt down. Now we can put our new gasket on this breather cover, and we'll set this in place. We've got this hole right here. We're going to leave the bolt out for now because we need that for our dipstick. I'm just going to leave these bolts a little bit loose right now until I've got this other one in the top left corner. All right, now we can put our new O-ring on for the dipstick, and I did put a little bit of oil on this thing. So we'll take this, slide it down into place. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and tighten these bolts down in a crisscross pattern. Next, we'll take our cooling elbow, install the new gasket, and tighten these bolts down to the engine. Next, we'll install the thermostat housing with the new gasket. Now we'll install the intake boots. Now we'll install the oil filter, and I'm going to put a little bit of oil around that ring. Then we're going to go 3/4 to 1 turn past where the gasket slightly touches the case. The next steps, we'll get this water pump ready to reinstall onto the motor. So our gasket kit actually did come with a new water pump gasket, and putting this on is going to make installing the water pump easier anyway. We'll take these 3 remaining bolts off the cover. Pull these covers apart, and then this O-ring is looking pretty smashed up, so good thing we're replacing it. So I'll go ahead, take the pick tool and pull this thing out. Now that we've got most of that O-ring out of here, I'm going to finish with a little Scotch-Brite and contact cleaner. Get the rest of the junk out of this and clean up this cover as well. Now that we have this cover cleaned up, I'm going to take these 2 new O-rings and put a little bit of grease on them, and I'm just going to slide these down into their grooves. Alright, so now with this cover, it's going to be hard for this gasket to stay in place while we install it unless we use a little bit of glue right here to hold it in place. So I'm just using a little gasket cinch. I'm going to let this tack up, and I'm not going to do it all the way around. This isn't creating the seal, this is just holding it in place. We'll just put this in a few different places and then wipe off any excess. And once this tacks up, we'll stick that O-ring into place. The next thing we need to do is install this water pump. Now there's a shaft coming off of the oil pump and it drives this, so we need to line these tabs with the shaft coming off the oil pump. So to do that, I'm going to insert this like this and then just rotate this so everything lines up. Oh, and you could feel and hear it catch right there. So it's not going to go all the way down if you don't have that lined up. One thing I want to point out, if you didn't have this water pump apart and you need to get this in place, you're going to have to turn the engine over either by using the primary drive clutch, put that in place temporarily, or you can have either the stator cover or valve cover off, turn the engine over while you're installing this. So at this point, now I'm going to install the water pump cover. So, and when I'm doing this, I already wiped off any excess gasket cinch that we had on here, and we'll just set this in place and tighten those bolts down. Next, we'll install the cooling hoses and clamps. Now that we have the hoses connected, we're going to go ahead and install these spark plugs. And that's it for the engine assembly. If you need to know how to put this engine back into your RZR, then follow us over to part 6 of our engine rebuilding series. And if you need any special tools or parts, check out our website. We've got a lot of different options, and we offer free shipping on orders over $75. Now, another thing, remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We have a lot of helpful content on there. Thanks for watching.